What happens when a grieving mother's last link to her son is threatened by her daughter-in-law's attempt to erase him from their home? Margaret's secret legal weapon changes everything. What happened next left everyone speechless. For nearly 30 years, Margaret had lived in the grand, creaking house at the end of Willow Lane. Every room echoed with memories: her son Daniel's laughter, his trophies lined up on the mantel, the sound of his piano playing drifting through the halls. Even after he married Julia and life became busier, those echoes remained her greatest comfort. But when Daniel died suddenly, a heart attack no one saw coming, the world became unrecognizable. Grief swallowed the house, and Margaret drifted through her days like a ghost. Julia, Daniel's widow, moved in fully, bringing with her a storm of change that felt less like healing and more like erasure. At first, Julia kept to herself, her grief as raw as Margaret's. But soon, small shifts appeared. Daniel's jacket vanished from the hallway hook. His favorite mug was replaced with a new set, all pastel florals, none of them his. The pictures in the hallway, Daniel's college graduation, the family trip to Lake Como, were quietly swapped for sterile landscapes and Julia's own family portraits. Daniel's piano, which no one but he ever played, was pushed against the far wall and covered in doilies and vases. Margaret noticed it all but said nothing. She understood the pain of loss. Perhaps, she reasoned, Julia needed to shape the house into something less painful. But the changes continued, creeping into every corner like ivy. Daniel's books were boxed and moved to the attic. His toolbox disappeared from the shed. The old garden gnome, a joke between mother and son for years, was tossed in the trash. The air in the house changed. Laughter was replaced by strained politeness. Julia moved briskly through her routines, remodeling the kitchen, repainting the den, filling the house with scented candles and pale linens. She barely looked at Margaret except to ask questions about bills or suggest updating the decor. Margaret's grief twisted into something darker, fear that her son's memory was being erased entirely. The final straw came one gray afternoon, as rain battered the windows and Margaret sat with a mug of tea in the now unfamiliar living room. She watched as Julia hauled Daniel's old trunk, a battered thing covered in stickers, out to the curb for the garbage. Margaret could barely breathe. She hurried outside, snatching the trunk from Julia's grip. "What are you doing?" she demanded, voice trembling. Julia shrugged, her eyes red-rimmed but unyielding. "It's just clutter, Margaret. We have to move on." Margaret clung to the trunk, feeling the first flare of anger in months. He lived here. This was his home. You can't just erase him. Julia's expression hardened. "He's gone. You're the only one who can't accept it." For the rest of the day, Margaret stayed in her room, tears blurring her vision. She opened Daniel's trunk, running her hands over the things that remained: a photo album, his old football jersey, a bundle of letters he'd written from college. She wept for her son, for the love that filled every corner of this house, and for the fear that his legacy was slipping away. As darkness fell, Margaret remembered something she hadn't thought of in years: a legal envelope tucked at the back of her closet, marked in Daniel's handwriting. With shaking hands, she retrieved it. Inside was a thick file: Daniel's will, property documents, and something else, a notarized letter he'd left for his mother, one she had never opened. Margaret stared at the envelope, her heart pounding. The pain of loss warred with a flicker of hope. Perhaps, within these pages, her son had left her a way to protect what mattered most. Downstairs, Julia continued her quiet purge, the sound of drawers opening and closing echoing up the stairs. But for the first time since Daniel's death, Margaret felt a glimmer of strength. They might try to erase Daniel from the home he'd loved, but Margaret would not let his memory fade so easily. She held the secret weapon in her hands, and she was just beginning to understand its power. Margaret sat on her bed, the unopened envelope trembling in her hands. The room was dim, rain still streaking down the window panes. Outside, Julia's car pulled away, tires hissing on the wet street, off, no doubt, to donate Daniel's clothes or negotiate with yet another decorator about freshening the house. Margaret felt, for the first time in months, that time had slowed enough for her to catch her breath. She reached for her reading glasses, then carefully sliced open the envelope Daniel had addressed to her all those years ago. The letter was dated just after his wedding to Julia, his handwriting bold, steady, full of the optimism she missed so much. "Dearest Mom, if you're reading this, something's gone wrong that I couldn't fix. You always protected me, So I wanted to leave something that would protect you in return. Inside this envelope are documents making you co-owner of the house. I wanted you to feel safe, always. Julia knows I updated the deed, but I don't think she realizes how much it means to me that you never have to leave. I trust you'll know what to do, if the time comes. I love you, always. Daniel. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She thumbed through the rest of the papers, a deed with both their names, a copy of Daniel's will specifying that his share of the house passed directly to her, a notarized letter from Daniel explaining the changes. Every document was official, signed and sealed, proof that Margaret's place in the home was more than sentimental, it was legal. She felt her strength return as she pored over every line, every clause. The secret weapon was more powerful than she could have imagined. She wasn't just a guest or an unwelcome reminder of the past. She was, by law, half-owner of the house Julia was so eager to remake. The implications spun in her mind. Julia's attempts to erase Daniel from the home, clearing out his things, changing the locks, even mentioning the possibility of selling, were not just callous, but invalid without Margaret's consent. Margaret's very presence was a safeguard, a living anchor for Daniel's memory and wishes. Margaret's grief was joined now by a cautious hope. She made copies of every document and stored them in her lockbox, then hid the originals in a new, safer spot, under a loose floorboard she'd used since her childhood. Afterward, she made herself a cup of tea, hands steadier than they'd been in months. Julia returned later that evening, her arms full of shopping bags. The two women passed each other in the hallway, a cool, heavy silence hanging between them. Julia tried to act as if nothing had happened, but Margaret's gaze lingered on her, no longer afraid or uncertain. For the first time, Margaret watched Julia as if from a new vantage point. She noticed the anxiety in Julia's movements, the way she flinched when Margaret entered the kitchen, the almost desperate energy behind every new project. Margaret wondered if the act of erasing Daniel wasn't a twisted kind of coping, if the urge to remove every trace of him was Julia's way of shielding herself from unbearable loss. But understanding didn't mean forgiveness. The next morning, Margaret awoke to find more of Daniel's things missing, a faded family photograph, the old chess set he used to play with her on Sunday afternoons. This time, Margaret searched the house until she found them, packed in a box labeled Charity in the guest bedroom. She set the box on Julia's side of the bed, confronting her when she returned home. "These aren't yours to give away," Margaret said, voice steady, not raised. "Daniel wanted these things here. And so do I." Julia bristled. "You can't keep living in the past, Margaret. It's unhealthy, for both of us." Margaret looked her straight in the eye. "Some things are meant to be kept. This house is one of them." That night, Margaret wrote to Daniel in her journal, telling him how his gift had saved her from despair. She reread his letter again and again, feeling him close, as if he were guiding her hand. The house felt different now, less like a battleground, more like a fortress she was ready to defend. Margaret was no longer just grieving. She was preparing. And somewhere deep inside, she felt Daniel's presence, strong and unyielding, urging her forward. Margaret woke the next morning with resolve in her bones and Daniel's letter beneath her pillow. The day dawned bright but cold, sunlight glinting off rain-washed windows. She took her time making breakfast, savoring every step of her old routine, the coffee brewed just as Daniel liked it, toast browned on one side, and the soft crackle of the radio in the background. For the first time in weeks, she felt present, anchored, her grief not erased but sharpened into something clear and purposeful. Julia, however, was already busy. Margaret heard her in the living room, shuffling through drawers, tossing things into boxes. By the time Margaret entered, half of Daniel's remaining books had vanished from the shelves, replaced by design magazines and catalogs. The walls, once lined with photos and artwork Daniel had chosen, now seemed to close in with bland, impersonal prints. Margaret's hands clenched as she watched Julia sweep away a lifetime with practiced efficiency. The tension crackled in the air. Margaret asked, quietly but firmly, "What are you planning to do with all of Daniel's things?" Julia paused, her jaw tight. "It's my house now too, Margaret. I need to make it livable for myself." She gestured at the magazines. "Don't you think it's time for a fresh start? This place is suffocating." Margaret's response was gentle, but the steel in her voice was unmistakable. "Daniel's memory lives here. It's not something to be cleared out like old dust." Julia scoffed, exasperated. "You can't keep clinging to the past. I'm doing what's best for both of us. You'll see, once the house feels new, you'll feel better too." That day, Julia hired a team of cleaners. Margaret watched as strangers boxed up Daniel's college yearbooks, his model airplanes, even the old quilt Margaret had made for him as a boy. She protested at first, but Julia ignored her. The workers loaded the boxes into a van marked "Donations," the engine idling in the driveway like a getaway car. Margaret waited until the house was empty, then called the charity shop and asked them to hold the boxes. She explained, in a trembling but dignified voice, that the items had been removed by mistake and would be reclaimed soon. The shop owner, hearing the desperation in her tone, agreed. Returning to the house, Margaret found Julia rearranging furniture, whistling a tuneless song. The living room looked stripped and hollow, like a hotel lobby after checkout. Margaret forced herself to remain calm. She tidied what she could, rescuing small remnants, a photograph here, a chess piece there, tucking them safely in her room. That night, she barely slept. She paced the floors, haunted by the echo of Daniel's voice and the emptiness of the rooms. The legal documents in her lockbox became a lifeline. She spread them out on her desk, reading every line by lamplight. The deed, the will, Daniel's letter, each one whispered reassurance. She could stop this. She could save what was left. Margaret decided to act. The next morning, she set an appointment with the family lawyer, Mr. Leary, who had handled Daniel's estate. She gathered all documents, originals and copies, into a neat folder. Her hands shook, but her heart was steady. At the law office, Mr. Leary listened patiently as Margaret explained everything: Daniel's wishes, Julia's campaign to erase him, the constant purging of his belongings. Margaret showed him the co-ownership deed and the will, her voice growing stronger with each word. Mr. Leary reviewed the documents with furrowed brow, then smiled. "Mrs. Green, you have every right to protect your son's memory and your own place in the home. Julia cannot sell, remodel, or remove you without your consent. Legally, you are equal partners here." Relief flooded Margaret. She asked what steps she could take next. Mr. Leary recommended she formally notify Julia of her rights in writing, backed by the legal documentation, and suggested she create a detailed inventory of everything being removed from the house. Margaret left the office lighter than she had felt in months. She stopped by the charity shop, reclaiming Daniel's things, and loaded them into her car. She was tired, but each box felt like a small victory. Back at home, Margaret stacked Daniel's belongings in her room, a silent promise that nothing more would disappear without a fight. She drafted a letter to Julia, careful and direct, explaining her co-ownership and intent to protect the home's history. That evening, she left the letter on the kitchen table, beside a photo of Daniel holding Margaret's hand as a child. Margaret knew the real battle was just beginning. But for the first time, she felt equipped, not just with grief, but with purpose, the law, and her son's love as her shield. The house was divided, yes. But Margaret was no longer powerless. She was ready to defend her son's legacy, room by room, memory by memory. Julia discovered the letter at breakfast. She picked it up with a skeptical frown, scanning Margaret's calm, resolute words and the attached photocopies: Daniel's will, the revised deed, the notarized letter that spelled out Margaret's legal authority as co-owner. Her face hardened as she reached the end, lips thinning in frustration. Margaret sat at the table, meeting Julia's eyes without flinching. "You cannot erase Daniel from this home," she said quietly. "He made sure of it. And you cannot erase me either." Julia's hands shook as she folded the letter, but her voice was icy. "So that's how it is. You're going to fight me, Margaret? Is that really what Daniel would have wanted?" Margaret's answer was steady. Daniel wanted his family protected. He wanted both our lives honored here. I will not let his wishes, or mine, be swept aside. The next days passed with tension thick as storm clouds. Julia retreated to her wing of the house, slamming doors and muttering on the phone. Margaret, meanwhile, moved with new purpose. She took Mr. Leary's advice, cataloging every item Daniel had left: photos, books, mementos, even old shirts and tools. She photographed everything, creating a digital record, and sent copies to the lawyer for safekeeping. She started spending more time in the community, drawing on old friendships and seeking allies. At church, she found support in Mrs. Patterson, who insisted on helping her scan documents, and in the pastor, who offered comforting counsel. Margaret even arranged a meeting with the Historical Society. After all, Daniel's grandfather had built the house, and its history was entwined with the town's. Word spread quietly. Friends stopped by to check on her. Neighbors dropped off casseroles and sympathy cards, sensing the battle unfolding within the once happy home. Julia responded by doubling down. She hired painters to refresh the living room, covering the walls with a bland gray that erased decades of color and warmth. She boxed up more of Daniel's possessions, storing them in the locked basement. She called in a realtor, just for an estimate, and Margaret overheard her whispering about buyout options on the phone. Margaret didn't confront Julia directly. Instead, she documented everything. When the realtor arrived, Margaret met him at the door with her folder of legal documents and a polite warning, "No sale will proceed without my approval." The realtor, glancing at the paperwork, quickly backed down. One evening, Julia tried another tactic, an emotional appeal. She arrived at Margaret's door with a bottle of wine and teary eyes. "I can't go on like this," she sobbed. "This house hurts too much. Every corner reminds me of what I've lost. I need a fresh start, Margaret. Please, just let me go." Margaret listened, heart aching for them both, but remained firm. "We can find a way to coexist, Julia. But not by erasing Daniel. His memory is not an obstacle, it's our only common ground." Julia grew cold again, her mask snapping back into place. "You're impossible. You're making everything worse." Margaret watched her leave, sorrow heavy in her chest, but knew she had done the right thing. Daniel's legacy mattered more than any comfort or easy peace. She spent that night moving Daniel's reclaimed things into her own room, arranging them with care. She made copies of every document, updating her inventory, and sent another note to Mr. Leary, documenting every encounter with Julia, every attempt to undermine her rights. Margaret felt the weight of loneliness, but also a newfound sense of agency. For the first time since Daniel's death, she was not just reacting to loss, she was shaping what came next. She was no longer a passive observer in the house her son had loved. Now, the lines were drawn. And Margaret, armed with law, memory, and love, refused to give another inch. The days that followed were a quiet war. Julia hardly spoke, her footsteps sharp on the polished floors, her movements abrupt as she stalked from room to room, searching for ways to reclaim control. Margaret matched her in silence, moving purposefully, the folder of documents never far from her side. The air inside the house was charged, each woman staking her territory in small but telling ways. One morning, Margaret awoke to the thud of furniture being dragged across the living room. Julia, with 2 hired movers, was rearranging the entire space, Daniel's old armchair shoved out of the way, the bookshelf emptied and pushed into the hallway. Margaret stood in the doorway, arms folded. "That chair stays," she said quietly. Julia's eyes narrowed, but she relented. The men slid the chair back, muttering apologies to Margaret as they passed. Julia watched, lips pressed tight, and began pulling books from the shelves, dropping some into boxes marked storage. Margaret let her take the ones Julia had bought, but as soon as Julia left the room, she rescued Daniel's favorite novels and stashed them safely in her wardrobe. Later that week, Julia started renovations in the kitchen. Contractors arrived early, hammering and sawing, plaster dust swirling in the air. Margaret knew Julia wanted to push her out, make her uncomfortable enough to leave on her own. But Margaret remained unshaken. She prepared her tea with an electric kettle in her bedroom, cooked simple meals on a hot plate, and left a note on the new counters, "Do not remove any fixtures. All changes must be agreed upon in writing by both owners." The contractors glanced at the message and, after checking the deed, refused to touch anything else without Margaret's consent. Julia's frustration grew. She cut off Margaret's access to the joint checking account, but Margaret had already opened her own. When Julia tried to schedule an appraisal for the house, Margaret intercepted the call, providing the attorney's number and a firm statement, "I will not authorize any appraisal, sale, or refinancing." The stress wore on both women. Margaret took refuge in the garden, reclaiming Daniel's rose bushes from the tangled weeds Julia had left to grow wild. She called her church friends, inviting them for tea in the yard. Their laughter drifted through the open windows, a quiet reminder that Margaret's world extended beyond the house. Meanwhile, Julia grew more desperate. She scheduled a meeting with a new lawyer and tried to convince Margaret to agree to a buyout, for both our sakes. Margaret, dignified but resolute, explained that Daniels had given her half the house not just as shelter, but as legacy. "You may find a way to leave, Julia," she said, "but I will remain, and Daniel's memory will remain with me." Julia's eyes flashed with anger. "You're just using Daniel's name as a weapon." Margaret shook her head. "No. I am honoring his wishes. There is a difference." At night, Margaret reread Daniel's letter, gathering strength from his words. She added notes to her inventory, took new photographs as Julia moved things, and updated Mr. Leary after every incident. The lawyer reassured her, "You're handling this exactly right. The law is on your side. Don't let her intimidate you." Margaret also reached out to the Historical Society, inviting them for a tour. The visit made an impression. Several members commented on the house's unique character, its deep roots in town history, and the story of Daniel's family. Julia, hearing praise for the old, clung even tighter to her modernizing plans, but she couldn't erase the past now that others were invested in preserving it. The turning point came when Julia, furious and flustered, removed the last remaining photo of Daniel from the mantel and locked herself in the den. Margaret stood outside the door, her voice steady and commanding. "Put the photo back, Julia, or I will take this to court." A long, tense pause followed. Then the door opened. Julia thrust the photo into Margaret's hands and disappeared upstairs. Margaret placed Daniel's picture on the mantel, right where it belonged, and for the first time since his death, she felt the house breathe again. The battle wasn't over. But Margaret had proven, to Julia and herself, that she would not let grief or intimidation erase the legacy she loved. And for the first time in months, she believed Daniel would be proud. The weeks wore on, each day bringing fresh skirmishes. Margaret moved through the house with new purpose, careful to document every change Julia tried to make without her consent. She began printing and organizing her emails, keeping a meticulous record of every contractor's visit, every attempted financial transaction, and every interaction that felt even slightly threatening. Her resolve became her armor, her patience, her sharpest weapon. Julia, meanwhile, grew increasingly isolated. Her friends stopped visiting, uncomfortable with the tension. The contractors, wary of crossing legal lines, often refused Julia's instructions unless Margaret signed off. Word spread among neighbors and community groups. Margaret was fighting for her home, and the law was backing her up. The pastor mentioned her in a Sunday sermon about the sanctity of memory and the strength to stand up for what is right. With Daniel's memory now protected by more than just love, by law, community, and Margaret's fierce vigilance, the house began to shift. Margaret's church friends visited often, bringing meals, helping restore Daniel's garden, and offering the comfort of their presence. She hosted afternoon teas in the backyard, inviting old friends and neighbors to share stories of Daniel, turning the garden into a living memorial. Meanwhile, Julia retreated deeper into frustration. Her remodeling projects halted, her phone calls unanswered. She tried contacting her own lawyer, but was told bluntly that the legal documents were airtight. Margaret could not be forced out, the house could not be sold or altered without her consent, and Daniel's will would stand in any court. One afternoon, Julia tried a new tactic, appealing to Margaret's compassion. She knocked on Margaret's bedroom door, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "This house is full of ghosts. I feel him everywhere, and it hurts. Don't you want peace, Margaret? For both of us." Margaret listened, empathy softening her expression but not her resolve. "Peace isn't found by erasing what we loved, Julia. I miss him too. But this home is all I have left, and I will protect it. You're welcome to stay, if you can honor that." Julia's face crumpled. For a moment, Margaret glimpsed the lonely, grieving woman behind all the hostility. But the gulf between them was too wide to cross in a single conversation. That night, Margaret updated her will, leaving clear instructions about the house and Daniel's legacy. She asked Mr. Leary to be executor, ensuring no loophole could ever be exploited. She wrote a long letter to Daniel, pouring out the heartbreak and pride of the past year, and tucked it in her journal with his old birthday cards. Slowly, Julia withdrew, spending more time out of the house, sleeping in late, avoiding Margaret at meals. The kitchen was once again filled with the aroma of Margaret's baking, the shelves refilled with Daniel's rescued books and mementos. Margaret began to feel a fragile peace settle over the home, a quietness that was no longer the hush of loss but the calm after a storm. One afternoon, Margaret received a call from the Historical Society. "We'd love to include your house in the town's heritage tour," the director said. "Your story has moved a lot of people. Would you consider opening your garden for the event?" Margaret agreed, feeling Daniel's spirit closer than ever as she planned for the visit. The preparations, trimming the roses, polishing the old family silver, arranging photos and letters for display, became a joyful labor, a way to keep Daniel's memory alive and shared. When Julia saw the flyers announcing the tour, she made one last, half-hearted attempt to protest, but found little support. The house was becoming a symbol for the whole town: resilience, memory, and the right to protect the past. Margaret knew the struggle wasn't over, but for the first time since Daniel's death, she felt hope blooming again. Her fight had changed the house, her relationships, even her own heart. The tide had turned, and with every small victory, Margaret reclaimed a piece of the home, and the life she and Daniel had loved. As summer deepened, the house on Willow Lane became the talk of the community. The Heritage Tour drew dozens of visitors, each moved by the story of Daniel's family and the steadfast mother who defended his legacy. Neighbors and strangers alike admired the restored garden, lingered over Daniel's childhood photos, and listened to Margaret's gentle tales about a boy who grew up in every corner of the old house. For Margaret, the event was more than a celebration. It was a declaration that the past would not be erased. The attention brought offers of help, new friendships, and even a reporter from the local paper, eager to share the story of the Green family's resilience. Margaret accepted with quiet pride, agreeing to an interview in the sunlit garden, Daniel's roses blooming around her like an honor guard. Julia watched it all unfold with growing resignation. The recognition, the community support, and Margaret's legal strength left her increasingly isolated. The few friends who remained on Julia's side offered only sympathy and advice to find closure. She grew quieter, spending her days away or in her room, the energy for battle finally waning. But the tension did not vanish overnight. Julia's bitterness sometimes flared, passive-aggressive remarks at dinner, cold shoulders in the hallway, slammed doors late at night. Margaret responded with unwavering dignity, never rising to the bait, always reinforcing her boundaries. She invited Julia to join the community events, to share in the legacy instead of fighting it. Most invitations were declined, but every so often, Julia would linger in the kitchen, listening to Margaret tell a story or watching the garden tours from the window. Mr. Leary, the family lawyer, continued to offer guidance. He helped Margaret arrange for a mediation, hoping to reach a formal agreement with Julia about house management and personal boundaries. The mediation was tense but productive. Julia was granted space and privacy, while Margaret's authority as co-owner and steward of Daniel's memory was enshrined in a legally binding agreement. In the weeks that followed, a fragile peace grew. The house filled with new energy. Margaret's friends visited more often, neighbors stopped by with fresh vegetables, and Jamie, her grandson, started spending weekends in the garden, learning to care for his father's roses. Margaret felt Daniel's presence in every bloom, every photograph, every laugh that echoed down the restored hallways. One evening, Julia quietly joined Margaret in the living room. She sat on the sofa, staring at a photo of Daniel as a young man, smiling and alive. After a long silence, Julia spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I thought forgetting would make it hurt less. But all I did was make things worse." Margaret's heart softened. She reached out, resting a gentle hand on Julia's. "We all grieve differently, Julia. But this house is big enough for both of our memories. Daniel would have wanted peace between us." Tears slipped down Julia's cheeks. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, the two women grieved openly together, joined by the pain and love they both carried. That night, Margaret wrote in her journal, capturing the moment she and Julia had finally found a small patch of common ground. She realized the greatest legacy Daniel had left was not in furniture or photographs, but in the chance for healing, even after the deepest wounds. The house, at last, felt whole again, a place where memory was cherished, pain acknowledged, and love allowed to endure. Autumn came to Willow Lane, painting the garden in golds and reds. For the first time since Daniel's passing, the house felt like a home again, not just to Margaret, but in subtle ways, even to Julia. The tense silences had softened into something resembling understanding. Julia spent more time downstairs, sometimes helping Margaret bake or tending to the roses with Jamie, her hands less hurried, her movements less guarded. The legal battles and emotional wars faded into memory, replaced by quieter, more meaningful exchanges. Margaret maintained her careful records, but no longer out of fear. She and Mr. Leary met for tea, discussing not only the state of the house but the future, how the home could someday be preserved for generations, with Daniel's story told and retold. The community's respect remained strong. Margaret's house was added to the town's official heritage list, and neighbors continued to visit, some bringing their children to hear stories in the garden, others just wanting to experience the peace that now lingered there. Margaret became something of a local legend, not for her defiance alone, but for her grace and generosity, her willingness to help others protect their own legacies. Julia, humbled and changed by the months of conflict, slowly came around. She and Margaret still had moments of disagreement, but they found ways to coexist, their shared love for Daniel becoming a quiet foundation for fragile peace. Julia even began contributing her own memories and photographs to the family archive, helping Margaret create a scrapbook that captured not only Daniel's life, but the journey of their healing. Jamie blossomed in this new atmosphere. He began to ask about his father's childhood, learning to play chess with Margaret and helping Julia document family recipes. The three of them sat together many evenings, sharing memories and laughter, pain still present, but no longer the shadow that consumed every corner. On the anniversary of Daniel's passing, Margaret organized a small garden gathering. Friends, neighbors, and even members of the Historical Society attended. Margaret spoke softly, recalling Daniel's generosity and humor, and Julia shared her own story of falling in love with him under the old willow tree. Jamie placed a single rose at the garden's edge, a symbol of both remembrance and hope. As dusk settled and lanterns glowed, Margaret realized how far she had come. Her secret weapon had not just preserved Daniel's memory or her legal rights. It had given her the courage to confront loss, to insist on respect, and to open the door to forgiveness. The house stood, unchanged in its bones but forever transformed by the resilience, love, and healing it now held within its walls. That night, Margaret sat by the window, Daniel's letter in her lap, and wrote one last journal entry. "You are still here. We are all still here. The legacy you left is not just a matter of law, but of heart. I will keep it alive, always." The home was safe. Daniel's memory was safe. And Margaret, no longer merely grieving, was living again, whole, honored, and at peace.